I interviewed my grandfather, Frank Cavalier, who was born in 1937 and grew up near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was in his 20s during the 60s and was a Marine from 1960 to 1962.
Mm-hmm. But then I chose to get involved in the reserves,
Mm-hmm.
primarily because you got paid extra money, and Julie and I could use whatever money we could make. So I got involved in Newark, New Jersey. I was a motor pool motor pool company, and I was a captain in a motor pool company.
After being a Marine, he went into the reserves, which he was luckily able to exit before the tension in Vietnam began to rise, which was without a doubt one of the most impactful events in the 60s. While the war in Vietnam started in 1955, the U.S. involvement in the war did not start until 1964, and the first U.S. Marines to land in Vietnam was on March 8, 1965. One of the most chaotic events during the war was the Tet Offensive, an attack organized by the North Vietnamese on more than 100 South Vietnamese cities. The attack was on the Vietnamese New Year known as Tet. The goal of these attacks were to strike uprising and move forward to achieve the final victory. Although they did not achieve final victory, they made psychological and political gains. Bombing was very common during the war, with about 260 million bombs dropped on Vietnam, over 580,000 bombing missions, amassing to 2.5 million tons of munitions used. There was a slight bombing halt while President Johnson and Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, met in Paris negotiating a treaty agreement. Throughout the war, there were more slight bombing halts, but the bombing officially ended on October 31st, 1968, having had 3 years of somewhat continuous bombings. The peace agreement to end the war was signed about 4.5 years later, on January 27th, 1973. During the time of the war, the U.S. government was telling the public that they were close to ending the war and that there was going to be light at the end of the tunnel, but they just needed more troops to get there. It was not found out until later that the U.S. was not close to the light at the end of this tunnel, and that they had not been close to winning the war, that they had actually been losing the war and lying to the country about it. As my grandparents recall it, people had lost trust in the government after finding about that they were lied to. The aftermath of the war really impacted the countries as well. Relations between Vietnam and America did not fully recover until the 1990s. The Vietnamese economy was destroyed, and there was immigration from South Vietnam. And the American soldiers were returning home to hate and anger from people protesting the war. My grandfather says that when soldiers would get off the planes from their tours, they would change before they got into public areas because people would yell at them and spit on them. Lyndon B. Johnson, who made decisions during the Vietnam War, was the vice president to JFK before he was assassinated. Both of my grandparents can very clearly recall the day that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, November 22nd, 1963. They, as well as many other Americans, recall many details about the day, like what they were doing, where they were, and how they felt about it. You guys remember exactly what you were doing when JFK was assassinated? Do you remember how shocking it was? You remember that day very clearly?
I remember exactly. I was working in New York City. I remember I was in the office, and I heard a guy in the back of the room said, "Oh my God, JFK's been shot." I remember that very clearly.
JFK was in Dallas, Texas, pre-campaigning for the re-elections, which were going to be in the following year. He went to a motorcade through the city in a black Lincoln convertible with his wife. At 12:30, multiple shots were fired, hitting him in his throat and skull. The shots reportedly were from a window on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. He was then pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Quickly, Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of presidency just 3 hours after Kennedy's death. Lee Harvey Oswald was charged with the assassination of JFK, but was then killed 2 days later by Jack Ruby. Only Oswald was charged with murder, even though there was speculation that it would have been impossible for him to shoot as rapidly as he did, and some people say that they heard shots from 2 different directions. No one else was charged with the assassination of JFK, and he was buried at the Arlington National Cemetery on November 25th, 1963. Another one of the most memorable events of the 60s was the moon landing. My grandparents also recall this day very well, and were amazed by the fact that someone could go to the moon. The spaceship took off on July 16th, 1969, and landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. What were you guys' reactions when you heard about like the moon landing, the first man on the moon? Like, was that just like
We were
July
just,
1969.
we were just astounded.
yeah?
It was awesome. Everybody, they were glued to their television. So,
But I thought we would, you know, that we would do that.
500 million people watched from their televisions, and there were also more people watching in person. The team consisted of Edwin Aldrin, Michael Collins, and Neil Armstrong. They only spent about 2 hours exploring the moon's surface, but had brought back samples of the rock for experimentation. Armstrong was the one who planted the American flag and said the world-famous line, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Once the astronauts got back to Earth, they were quarantined for 16 days because scientists thought that there could have been different pathogens from space, but there were not. The reason it is often referred to as the race to the moon is because the US and Soviet Union were racing to get to the moon first. Scientists had said that it was not America who had won the endeavor, but it was mankind who had. This was a big step for space exploration and paved the way for attempts to get to other planets like Mars. My grandfather believed that being an American during the 60s was like being the best and to help people out, just like the country had been trying to be. My grandfather represents what he sees an American to be by succeeding and making a good life, also by doing his part for his country by serving in the military. While not everyone has done the same things as my grandfather, many people see similar qualities in being an American that he had. While many people of the modern youth of America think that the 60s was to be full of riots, protests, and movements that we learn about now, it seems as though not many people from the time remember an America caught up in the events that we may think of now.
sunshine.